every now and then when I'm doing a live stream, I'll mention a book I've read. And I've had people say, Steve, tell us more about those books you read. So today is a book report, but it's going to be brief reports on a variety of books I've read recently that I enjoyed. I've read a couple books that didn't really make the list, but many of the books I've read recently are books that I think are really, really cool and that you should consider looking at if you're interested in the topics. So many of you will notice that there's two books up here normally that are right here, right now. And these are both books about the Titanic written by Daniel Allen Butler. And The Other Side of the Night is specifically just about the relationships between the Carpathia, the Californian, and the Titanic, and what happened that night regarding those three boats. So very, very specifically about that slice of the story. I read this one first. And then after I read it, I thought, I need to read his main book, Unsinkable, which is the full story of the Titanic. And it is an amazing work. This is one of those books that when I read it, every page, I'm like, this is just an accomplishment. This is an amazing, amazing book. So if you want to know what happened with the Titanic itself, this book right here. If you're already knowledgeable of the Titanic, or you want to read this one and then read this one, because what happened with the Carpathia and the Californian, which are two ships that were nearby, and one of them actually helped with the efforts to rescue afterwards, and one of them did not. And how that came about is an amazing story as well. The other book that's often over this shoulder right here is Hillsborough, The Truth. And this right here is a guy who latched onto a story when it happened and followed the story. And he's actually one of the protagonists in the story because he's the guy, and I apologize, it's Phil Scratton. I could be mispronouncing the last name, but he is a professor who teaches criminal justice. And when the Hillsborough story happened, and if you don't know about this, there was a crush at a soccer match, a football match in England at a place called Hillsborough. And the crush ended up killing 96 people. And the story of what happened and how it was treated by the people in power, how it was treated by the press, is just one of the most astounding stories. And I actually have been following this story. I remember when it happened. I was actually working at a radio station when it happened. I saw it cross the wire that there was some kind of catastrophe at a soccer match in England. And I remember reading that at the time, and then, of course, seeing documentaries about it ever since. And the amazing part is that this guy, Phil Scratton, has hung on to this story, and he's been one of the people pushing for justice for the victims of this event. I've talked to people who are familiar with this, who are from England, some of whom have very strong feelings about it. And I've actually talked to people who are on both sides of this. I've actually talked to people who are like, I wish they would just stop talking about that altogether. And I have to tell you that as someone who writes history books myself, it is our job as a historian, it's our jobs as historians, plural, to make sure that things aren't forgotten, okay? And so Hillsborough is something that needs to be remembered and understood. And the book is called Hillsborough, The Truth. And when you read the book, it's going to really impress upon you the tragedy that happened, not just with the people dying, but then the cover-ups and the finger pointing and the fact that there were people out there, including family members, for instance, who would not give up. They wanted this story to be told properly, and they wanted justice for the victims. And so I would highly recommend this book as well. Now, I'd mentioned before, I'm also fascinated by economics, economic history, and so on, and also, to some extent, the idea of insurance and risk management, which, by the way, Seinfeld fans will remember that George listed risk management as an expertise of his on one of his resumes, and he didn't even really know what it was. But this book by Peter Bernstein, Against the Gods, is one of the greatest plays on words of all time with book titles because, of course, you think of the phrase of against the odds, right? But against the gods, and this is a reference to the fact that in the old days, people thought stuff happened just because, I don't know, God did it or gods did it or just nature or fate. We could never possibly predict the future or understand why something happened. And of course, it's the remarkable story of risk, and he talks about how it developed over time because nowadays, we take this for granted that, oh, you can buy insurance against this, and an insurance company's done some studies, actuarial, and statistical to try to figure out what the odds are of something happening. We talk about this like it's just another field of math. There's a time when, no, it wasn't a field of math, and it turns out it wasn't that long ago. So this was a great book. Also, I highly recommend it. Also, on the same topic of economics, Traders, Guns, and Money. And if you studied any of that most recent collapse with the credit default swaps and all that stuff, you discover that there's stuff happening at a level that is so complicated that almost no one understands it. And the guy who wrote this book, and I'm not even going to attempt his name, Satyajit Das, but he goes through and tells stories about things that happen at that level with financial instruments that are bought and sold by like funds and companies. And some of them are so complicated that no one understands them except like 3 people. And unfortunately, people buying them don't understand them, and they wind up in these really weird situations where they get just totally taken to the cleaners. And it's a fascinating book. The Financial Times said a distinctly timely book, too. So it's just interesting because this guy was in this field for the longest time, buying and selling these things. And then later he became a consultant, and he explains this stuff in a way that it's a fascinating book to read. And I highly recommend it as well. Believe it or not, I read a book. I may have mentioned this one before. I know I mentioned it in a live stream. The Lighthouse of Stalingrad. And I've read all kinds of World War II books, many, many World War II books. And I've read books about the battles. I've read first-person accounts. I've read the overview stuff. And so I've read about Stalingrad before. And, of course, there's movies about it, so on. And this book focuses on a particular building that became a major point in the battle. And Stalingrad, in case you don't know, was one of the big turning points of the war, where the Germans sent in the 6th Army into Stalingrad to try to take this big industrial town that was very, very important to the Russians. And the Russians rallied the troops on the other side of the river and basically tied up the Germans. And I'm summarizing this very, very briefly here. And then wound up encircling the Germans, and it cost the Germans, in essence, the 6th Army, which was one of the biggest defeats that the Germans ever had, but certainly up to that point in the war was a massive defeat. And this guy, Ian McGregor, writes this book. It's extremely readable, and he talks about what's happening there. And it's interesting because I'd heard a lot of it before, but never told in a context of the big picture, but also down to the granular level of like what different people were doing and what was happening. And it's an amazing story as well. So it's told very, very well. But it's The Lighthouse of Stalingrad. One author says a wonderful, important, and timely book. And I would agree with that wholeheartedly. So it is an amazing book. I actually most recently read River of Darkness. And this is an amazing story because it tells a story of a guy named Francisco Orellana. I'd never heard the name before, as far as I know. And he is considered to be the first European to travel the full length of the Amazon by going over the Andes and then coming down the river. And he was with a larger group of people led by one of the Pizarros. And at one point in time, the expedition got stuck someplace. They had no food. And they were running out of supplies. They'd run out of food long before. They're doing things like eating their saddles because they'd already eaten their horses. I'm not making that up. And at one point in time, Orellana says, how about if I go downstream? Because they'd spoken to some natives who said that there might be food available right downstream, but they weren't sure. And so Orellana took a group of men and they went downstream. And when they went downstream and finally found food, it was further than they thought. But when they tried to come back upstream, it was impossible. So they wound up just saying, we'll just go down that way. Meanwhile, Pizarro thinks he's been abandoned by this traitor. He turns around and heads back upstream and manages to make it back to town, missing like a huge portion of his men. Everything he brought with him is gone. He literally walks back into town in rags. Meanwhile, Orellana heads downstream. Turns out it's a very treacherous trip, but he eventually makes it. And he makes it out to the ocean and gets to civilization, winds up making it all the way back to Europe, and talks him into letting him take another expedition back. And it's just such a bizarre and fascinating story. And like I said, I'd never heard of the guy before. And so, you hear these stories about like the first European descendants who saw the Mississippi River, for instance, or the first to see Lake Superior, right? And so here's the guy, the first guy of European descent to take the Amazon all the way down. And what's interesting about it is, on the one hand, he knew a bit, like he knew enough of the language, for instance, of some of these tribes that he could communicate with them, the ones that they weren't fighting with. But on the other hand, really didn't know how long the river was. It turns out it was substantially longer than they thought it was. So that's amazing. I've mentioned these two books before, especially in live streams, because a viewer sent them in to me, because Radio Days is a very, very cool biography of, in essence, a radio station. And that's WMMS in Cleveland. And of course, they're nicknamed The Buzzard. And they were one of the original rock and roll powerhouses in radio. They started out as like a free-form station. They've gone through a bunch of evolutions since then, but they've always been known as being one of the iconic radio stations. Radio, by its very nature, is local, right? So if you're not in Cleveland or in the area, in the old days, you couldn't listen to them. You just heard about them. But they were a station that's legendary. And then there's a follow-up book, Cleveland Radio Tales, which is written by the same author here, along with Janice Olszewski. Mike Olszewski wrote the first book. The two of them wrote the second book. And this is kind of like a follow-up with a bunch of other stories to fill in some gaps and stuff. I'm guessing they learned after they put out their book. Also a book, Our Band Could Be Your Life. And this is one of those books. Michael Azarad wrote this, and he tells the story about a bunch of different bands that were put out on independent labels back in the day. Black Flag, the Minutemen, Mission of Burma, Minor Threat, Husker Du, The Replacements, Sonic Youth, and so on. And basically, he interviewed members of these bands and got the stories of these bands, because it turns out that a lot of them, although they're scattered around the country and they didn't all necessarily play the exact same kind of music, I think The Replacements was probably a little more marketable than some of these other bands. The stories are surprisingly similar in how parallel they are. That is, that they had very similar stories explaining how they got together, how they started, how they toured, how they got a record deal. And it's interesting because some of these bands became quite well known, but they didn't become quite well rich. And one of the things that I found most interesting was how many of these bands didn't want to be successful. And I know that sounds like, wait, what? But like, for instance, The Replacements. If you know anything about music, you've heard of The Replacements. They got some great music. Alex Chilton is a great song, named after another great musician. Of course, Pleased to Meet Me. It's the album. But they got several albums, but I'm saying that's one that's got a great title. But of course, You Be Me for a While and I'll Be You. And like, they got airplay on KROQ Los Angeles. I mean, I remember hearing the radio on 89X in Detroit. The Replacements. I got some of their albums. But the thing about them is they started out making music, and it almost appears that they never wanted to do anything but simply make music as a small band. And so when they got a big record deal, it actually looks like they were trying to sabotage it. They went on to Saturday Night Live drunk. and it sounded like it. I mean, it's one of those things where you look at the story, and I'll contrast that with Rob Zombie. And I forgot where I read the interview, but Rob Zombie was accused of selling out when he finally got some success. And people said, "Hey, you sold out." And he goes, "I've been trying to sell out for the longest time. Nobody was buying." And so it's one of the strangest parts of rock and roll is how cool it is to not be successful. And so it turns out are a lot of bands and musicians who view the struggle of the up-and-coming band to be cooler than making it. Okay? Oh, look at those sellouts. They're playing sold-out stadiums. I wouldn't want to be like them. And it's interesting because that appears to be another theme in many of these bands, is that they did shows in small places, oftentimes like at people's houses or little tiny venues that held like 30 people. And they would do shows like that. And when they had the opportunity to do bigger shows, they're like, no, don't really want to do that. And it's like, wait, what? So some of the stories are fascinating. Sonic Youth, another example, where they got some radio airplay. But like I said, it's just amazing to see the insight that you get from reading about all these different bands. And again, it's Our Band Could Be Your Life. And scenes in the American indie underground from the decade of 81 to 91. And so I remember that quite well. And again, I knew people in bands who were trying to make it. And the fascinating part is some bands didn't want to make it. And there you go. And then finally, I started off with the 2 books by Daniel Allen Butler about the Titanic. And he contacted me a while back and said, hey, I noticed you got 2 of my books on your set. And I look at his name and I realize he's the author. And so we corresponded back and forth. And I said, I loved your books. And I said, by the way, I'm also an author. I've written some history books. And he says, tell you what, he goes, let's trade books. And I said, okay, which book of mine do you want? And I sent him, I believe, the Chrysler Turban Car. And he said, well, take a look at my books and tell me which one you want. So I looked at the guy's listing of books, and he's written quite a few books. And in there was Field Marshal, The Life and Death of Erwin Rommel. And now I've read books on Rommel. I've seen documentaries on Rommel. He pops up in all kinds of, World at War and so on. He pops up all over the place. Rommel's one of the best known German commanders from World War II. And I thought to myself, okay, I want to read that because I know what kind of research you did on the Titanic book. But I'm also fascinated at the idea that to write a book about someone who lived in another country and spoke a different language creates another whole problem altogether with respect to research. Because many of the documents are going to be in German. They're going to be in German locations, or at least over in Europe. And this is one of the best researched, most detailed, authoritative books I've ever read on any topic. And it's a masterpiece of a biography. And so he doesn't glorify Rommel, but he does do, I believe, a very accurate biography of him. And it clarified a lot of issues that are often glossed over in other things like documentaries where they got 60 minutes to tell the whole story. But of course, it's 48 once you take out the commercials. And then you got to tell the whole story of, World War II in 48 minutes. So it's amazing the details in this book. So if you're into World War II, I'd highly recommend this and The Lighthouse of Stalingrad. Likewise, if you're into the Titanic or that era of history, the early 20th century, you've got The Other Side of the Night or Unsinkable, also both by Daniel Butler. And those are the books I've read recently. Currently reading another one right now. We'll see how that goes. But that's my book report for the other channel. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.